All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Jason Haremza. I'm a planner with Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this session on observations of hamlets in upstate New York. I'm going to go over just a few logistical items before we get started. This meeting is being recorded, so a recording of this session will be available on our Genesee Finger Lakes YouTube channel shortly. The slides will also be available, posted as a PDF on our website. We're asking folks to stay muted during the presentation. We should have plenty of time for discussion and questions and answers at the end. In the meantime, feel free to use the chat room function during the presentation, and I'll take a look at that as we get towards the end. My colleague Emily Royce is here. She will be assisting me, and in the event of any technical difficulties, and I know they have happened before, if anything happens, hopefully the meeting will continue, and I will rejoin shortly, but Emily will hold down the fort while I reboot my computer or anything like that. As you can see, I'm also presenting from the office this evening, and our building has an interesting feature. The lights are on a timer, so if my screen goes dark, it may not be any kind of computer issue. It's just that the timer on the lights has gone off. So keep that all in mind this evening. This is going to be a pretty informal chat, I think. So hopefully folks will enjoy that. And again, hopefully we'll have time for some good discussion and questions and answers at the end. So, one more thing, please, if you are here for credit, please make sure your full name is visible in the participant list so that we can make sure that anybody who wants documentation of attending will receive that. I know a lot of local government folks are here for their training credit. So please make sure your full name is available if you're looking for that. And with that, I will get started. I'm going to share my screen and we will get going. All right. All right, so I'm an upstate New York native, and I have been doing this planning thing now for a little over 20 years. And I grew up in a very rural area of Western New York, and have spent a fair bit of time traveling around the Finger Lakes in Western New York and observing a lot of different types of communities. I worked for the city of Rochester for many years, but more recently I worked for the town of Danby in Tompkins County, which is a town of 3,500 people. And so, you know, in that time and those various experiences, I feel like I've, excuse me, seen a lot of the variety of communities that make up upstate New York. And even going back to my student days as a geography student at SUNY Geneseo, I became interested in the terminology and the system of local government we have here in New York State. And folks are generally familiar with cities and towns and villages, but the hamlet is a little bit more obscure, a little bit less defined. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about hamlets and their historic origins, and where they can go from here, and whether they have a place in 21st century society. So this opening picture is a graphic from a project down in, I believe it's either Tennessee or North Carolina, but the concept of a hamlet as a small and relatively compact neighborhood, in a sense, is being rediscovered by places that are seeing a lot of growth. And rather than see that growth spread across the landscape on 3-acre or 5-acre lots, the idea is to concentrate it a little bit into a small village or hamlet, as is shown here. I did not actually grow up in a hamlet. The view on the left is essentially the view from the front yard of the house I grew up in, very rural. And the closest hamlet, which was also the mailing address of where I grew up, was East Concord, New York, and that's the image on the right there. And this, growing up in this environment, really formed my impressions of communities, whether they be very rural areas, like my immediate neighborhood growing up, or the hamlet 4 miles down the road, which even into the 1980s still had a general store in the building on the left, dating from the 1860s. And then even further down the road was the village of Springville, which had a very traditional 3-block main street with stores and a movie theater, and that's the village where the hospital I was born in and where I went to elementary school. So all these traditional places were very formative in how I became a planner. And that many years later, through the twists and turns of school and career, and I found myself working for the town of Danby in Tompkins County. And as I mentioned, the town of Danby is about 53 square miles with 3,500 people across those 53 square miles. So very rural. It's in the foothills of the Appalachians, just south of the city of Ithaca in Tompkins County. The hamlet, which is pictured here, the hamlet of Danby, is strung out along State Highway, Route 96B, which runs between Ithaca and Owego, New York, and is the most developed and quote unquote urban part of those 53 square miles. And it's where town hall is, where the library is, a church, and a few houses, and not a lot else. And it very much fits the pattern of a lot of hamlets I've seen especially in the more rural parts of our 9-county region, but also adjacent parts of the Southern Tier and Western New York, and pretty much all of Upstate New York. The pattern of Danby is very typical to what I've seen in and around our region. Here's a little bit of orientation for you. So Town Hall, which is where I took this picture, I'm standing in the driveway of Town Hall, is 7 or 8 miles south of downtown Ithaca and about 800 feet higher in elevation. So there were times when I was sitting in Town Hall and it would be snowing, but down in the city of Ithaca, it would be raining. And I just loved the, observing that difference in topography, and really highlighting the sense of place of where we were up in the Danby Highlands, as they were sometimes called. And there's just a few images, showing a little bit more of the hamlet. That the church is just an incredible structure, a federal style building from the I want to say 18 teens. So at this point, well over 200 years old. And then a few houses also from that era, and a few more up through the 1850s and 60s. But the hamlet of Danby, like many hamlets, never had a railroad connection, and without that form of transportation technology in the 19th century, growth only occurred to a certain point. And by about the time of the Civil War, the hamlet of Danby, and in fact the town of Danby, was about as big as it was ever going to be. And we'll get into a little bit more of that later on in the presentation. There's an aerial shot, a current aerial shot of the hamlet of Danby. And I think you should be able to see my pointer. This is that beautiful church. Here's the historic part, and then they've added on over the years. It's still an active church. Town Hall is up here, and that also contains the library. There's a pretty large park right across from Town Hall. There is a auto repair here. And as far as amenities and retail in the hamlet, that's about it. And that's another one of the challenges of hamlets that that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, and hopefully hear from your perspectives what your thoughts or your experiences have been with hamlets in your communities. I show this current aerial and related to this historic map from the mid-19th century, just to show how much has changed in that 150, 170 years at this point. And if you look closely at this map of just about the same area, if you look closely at the street patterns, you can see these same roads are still here in 2021 as they were in the 1860s. But you see a lot more of activity if you look closely. So you can see a post office, a couple stores. There's a hotel on the corner here. The church is, at the time, it was a Presbyterian church. That's changed over the years, but the church is still the church. We have some industry along the creek. We have a mill, we have a tannery. And so a lot more economic activity than is currently the case. And this is, you know, again, this is a pattern we see time and time again across upstate New York. I've worked on many comprehensive plans for rural towns, and as part of working on the comprehensive plan, you often do a little bit of history of the town. And it's really interesting how much local history kind of ends about 1900. So you know, it often begins with the first European American to show up in the area. Unfortunately, a lot of local history does not devote a lot of time, if any, to the indigenous people that were here before us. So the local history will begin in the 1790s or early part of the 1800s, and talk about the first white people that arrive, and then talk about the growth of the community and the businesses that are formed and the farms that are established. And then, you know, generally by the late 19th century, that often dwindles, and that tracks very closely with what was going on economically and demographically in a lot of these towns. What I found so fascinating when I went to Danby, and again, these demographic figures are not unusual by any means. The town had robust population growth in the early 19th century, up until about the time of the Civil War. And in fact, in front of Town Hall itself, there's a pretty grand Civil War monument that the townspeople put up in 1870 or so, with a lot of names on it. And you can tell that was a turning point for the town. A lot of the younger generation went off to war. Many did not return. Those that did may have chosen not to come back to a rural town like Danby, but seek better or more plentiful opportunities in places like Ithaca or Binghamton, Watkins Glen, or even Rochester, Syracuse, places with more opportunities. And so you can see throughout the latter part of the 1800s and through the early 20th century, the population of the town declined pretty dramatically, so that think it hits the low point here in 1940 at 1,200 people, and then slowly begins to increase. But it wasn't until the 1980 census that the town grew as large as it was back in 1850. So that's more than a century of decline, and then finally growth in the more recent past. And this reflects the location of Danby. As I mentioned, it's within at most 10 or 12 miles from Ithaca. So as Ithaca grows and Tompkins County as a whole grows, a town like Danby is seeing rural residential development, people who work in Ithaca and would like to live in a place with rural character and wide open spaces. Of course, the tension there is that these folks moving to Danby for the rural character are buying 3-acre parcels and building new houses and changing the very rural character of the place that they are seeking to live in. So how to balance that is a topic for another session, but it's a real challenge for how we develop in upstate New York and rural upstate New York, and how we regulate development in rural upstate New York. Moving on from Danby for a minute, the hamlets there's different typologies of hamlets, right? So if we go back a moment to Danby, you can see that it's pretty linear. It's strung out along 96B, State Route 96B, which historically was for over 200 years the main road between Ithaca and Owego. And a hamlet like Danby has a very linear form. If you go to a place like this, the hamlet of Gorham in Ontario County, you see a little bit more of a grid of streets beginning to develop. So you have the main street, you have a much more compact, quote unquote, downtown with half a dozen sort of storefront buildings here clustered in one stretch of Main Street. But you also have some side streets developing. So you begin to see a pattern of streets and blocks that are a little more reminiscent of a village. And so hamlets exist, the built form, as us planners like to say, hamlets exist on a continuum. So you can have very low density hamlets like Danby that are very linear, or you can have larger ones like this, or even hamlets like the hamlet of Savannah in Wayne County, which used to be a village, or the village of Macedon in Wayne County, or also the village of Pike in Wyoming County. All of those are places that used to be incorporated villages, but the villages have dissolved. So there is no requirement as to how big a hamlet is, but one of my goals eventually is to sort of catalog and sort the hamlets in our region based on some of these typologies. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment. But one of the ways to sort these hamlets and start to categorize them are some of these attributes, and these are some things you can begin to take note of in your town if you are having challenges with hamlet or hamlet development, or as was the case in Danby, the town really would like to have seen development in the hamlet where development has historically occurred. As we saw with the historic map, that's where stores used to be, that's where restaurants used to be, but that wasn't the kind of development that was occurring in the past 10 and 20, 30 years. But these are some of the things that if I ever get the chance to do a catalog of hamlets in the Genesee Finger Lakes region, I'd like to include some of these categories. So, do they have public water? Do they have public sewer? And these two infrastructure are pretty important because it can mean the difference between having making infill development easier or much more difficult. And this is one of the big challenges in Danby, where you did have still a few amenities in the hamlet. You had the library, you had town hall, you had a very active church congregation. And so there was a desire to reinforce those with some infill development, some more affordable housing where people could walk to these amenities. And pretty unique to Tompkins County, the hamlet of Danby actually had a bus stop. So you could fairly easily commute into the city of Ithaca from that hamlet without having to have access to a car. So that was another big selling point for doing some infill development there and trying to reinvigorate the hamlet and get a critical mass of people so that maybe there would be enough people to support a small store or restaurant in the hamlet, which it's been lacking for many years. But aside from that, as I mentioned, does it have a street grid, or is it very linear? Is it just strung out along one sort of main road? Are there any sidewalks? What does it feel like to walk in the hamlet? That was another big problem in Danby, where even though the posted speed limit was 40 miles an hour, traffic on 96B routinely was much faster than that. And even though there were very wide shoulders on 96B, I can tell you from experience, it was not a pleasant or comfortable place to walk. So if your community, if you talk about in your comprehensive plan, encouraging walkability or encouraging, choice in transportation, these are the things to think about, especially if you're a rural town that might have a hamlet or two. Maybe these are the places to focus on, since you're not going to necessarily be able to or ever afford sidewalks across your entire town. But let's look at the places where, if we could, where would sidewalks make the most sense? Are there any services in the hamlet? A library, a school, especially an elementary school, places of worship, government offices. These are all on some level amenities that make people want to choose to live in the hamlet. And we'll get to that idea of choice in a little bit. And then sort of private sector amenities. Is there any kind of store? Is there any sort of restaurant? And this to me is one of the key challenges of hamlets in 2021. If we go back to this historic map from the 1860s, there was a reason for people to be here, right? There was multiple stores, there was a post office, there were businesses, there was the church. Most of those have gone away. So, anytime we choose where to live involves trade-offs. And right now, I live in the city of Rochester, and there are trade-offs for making that choice. So I have neighbors very close to me on either side. The trade-off for that is I have lots of restaurants and stores within a really short walking distance in my neighborhood. If you live in a larger village, you often have something similar where, yes, you have neighbors pretty close by, but you have the amenities of living in the village. You have the shops and restaurants on Main Street. Maybe sort of the big boxes on the edge are not that far, and if you had to, you could walk to Walgreens or CVS or Rite Aid, as the case may be. And those are all amenities. Maybe your kids could walk to school. So one of the key challenges of the hamlet is you have some of the downsides of living in a city or village that is You have houses relatively close together, certainly much closer than in the rural areas, just half a mile or a mile up the road, where you can be surrounded by a lot of forests and fields. Although that is until the larger landowners decide to keep parceling off frontages in 3 or 5 acre chunks, and suddenly that rural ambiance no longer feels so rural. But so as it stands now in the hamlet, you have neighbors fairly close on either side. But unfortunately, you don't have many of the amenities of a village or a city environment here. So there's not a whole lot you can walk to. You have the park, you have the library, you have the bus stop. So if you worked in Ithaca, and people did do this, they did take the bus into Ithaca. If you're active in this church, you have the church here, and there were a lot of different activities at the church, everything from garage sales to Tai Chi classes. So that was an amenity for the community, but not a whole lot, and not what us planners call a third place. And that was when I worked for the town of Danby. That is what people wanted the most, was this idea of a third place. And some of you are probably asking, what is a third place? Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. But again, to me, the key challenge for Hamlets in 2021 is they have the disadvantages of living in a village or a city that is aging houses, often very lovely and historic houses, but not everybody wants to take on the project of keeping a 150-year-old house standing. I live in one, and I know it's it's a challenge sometimes. And neighbors fairly close by, and all of the issues that comes along with that. So if you have good neighbors, it's not a problem. But unfortunately, not everybody lives the same way in terms of noise and things like that. So so that's one of the key challenges with Hamlets. And I include some of these images. These are actually a newer development in the past 15, 20 years or so, from just over the border in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. And I include them to show that compact development does not mean Manhattan, that you can do new development that's very compact, that's very walkable, but that's also very much on a village or hamlet scale. And that's why I included images like this. Some of these are also single floor living, which is very important. My parents are in their 70s, and I know a lot of folks like to age in place, and not having to negotiate stairs is a real amenity. And having affordable housing, especially for seniors, was a topic that's come up again and again in a lot of the communities I've worked for. So this guy, I used my nephew here, and someday he's going to make me stop using this picture. He's 8 years old now. But again, I use it to, and my favorite quote is at the bottom there. One of my favorite quotes is, one of the key benefits of a hamlet, again, like a village or a city neighborhood, is that you can get places on your own 2 feet. You are not dependent on a motor vehicle to get around. And but that's only a benefit if there are places to go, if the walk is safe and pleasant. Because if it's not, then there's much less of a benefit in being in a walkable place. I use this image. I have not found a good one, unfortunately, from our part of the world yet. This is actually from the UK. But I show it as an example of a pathway that is, let's say, appropriate in a rural setting. I've heard a lot of times that people, especially people that move to a more rural or suburban place, they don't want sidewalks because, well, sidewalks are what cities and villages have, and they want to feel like they live in the country, and they don't want to have sidewalks. They don't want to have sidewalks because they don't want to pay to maintain them or shovel the snow from them. And those are separate issues, and we can talk about, there are some policy methods around that we can talk about if anybody wants to. But I show this image to reinforce the idea that having a safe, comfortable place to walk does not necessarily mean a sidewalk. It can mean a pathway or a trail or something that looks more like this, that fits into the rural character of a place. And I think too often we tend to think of all or nothing. Like, it either has to be a city like Rochester or New York, or it has to be forested wilderness. And I think there's a lot of types of places in between that can be a lot more friendlier places to live for folks. So we went over some of these amenities to think about if you have hamlets in your community. And again, if I ever get to do my project of recording and cataloging hamlets in the region, these are some of the criteria I would use. And believe it or not, unlike incorporated forms of government, like cities, towns, villages, the state of New York all has really good data on all of those, how many we have, when they were incorporated, what the populations are. But because hamlets have no formal definition, there's no list of them. One of the ways I was going to go about doing this is just using State Department of Transportation maps, because they have a system for putting up signs when you come into a hamlet and when you leave, and they have some criteria for that. So I was going to start with that. But I'm really fascinated by this topic, and was going to use it as a starting point, and then sort of solicit input from folks around the region to tell me what are the hamlets that are recognized in your town. So I mentioned in Danby and in a lot of places the idea of a third place, and this comes from a gentleman named Ray Oldenburg. He's got a couple books out, and I have the covers of on the lower left and lower right there. But the idea of a third place is that it's not home, it's not work, it's the third place you go. And it could be a pub, it could be a coffee house, it could be a restaurant, it could be a library, it could be a community center, but it's some place where you go to interact with other humans. And I think especially in the past 2 years with the pandemic, the idea of having these types of third places is so important. And they don't even have to be a permanent third place. It could be a farmer's market that takes place every couple of weeks, and that was one of the directions we were going in with Danby. And just because without having an elementary school, which closed about 20 years ago, they lost their post office. Other than randomly running into your neighbors when you go to get a dog license or pay your taxes at town hall, there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity for those casual interactions that build community, and that's what they were so hopeful for in creating a third place. Again, their dream was to have some place like this place on the left here. This is a place called Brookton's Market. It is in the hamlet of Brooktondale, which is in the next town over from Danby, in the town of Caroline in Tompkins County. If you ever have the chance, I hope they're still open, but if you ever have the chance and are down in the Ithaca area or east of Ithaca, I highly recommend a stop there. When I first stopped there, I was blown away. This was a place that was, by day, it was a little restaurant. They had a few tables, they had a counter you could order, they did breakfast, they did lunch. They had a few shelves of basic groceries, and in the evening it turned into a pub. They had a bar, they had trivia nights, they had open mic nights, they had live music. this was the quintessential third place. And I have no idea how successful they were economically. I hope they were successful. You know, these places are tough to operate and make a profit with. I'm hoping by having different activities over the course of the day, from breakfast in the morning to the pub and open mic nights in the evening, that they were successful. And this is what everybody in Danby dreamed about. But what I tried to manage their expectations and said, well, I know we all would love something like the Brookton Market. However, a place like Tim Hortons here can also serve that role of a third place. And a Tim Hortons does not need to look like the stereotypical Tim Hortons. In fact, this one is from a hamlet, the hamlet of Bushnell's Basin in the town of Perrington in Monroe County. And I like to use it as an example because some of you, if you're on land use boards or town boards, you may be seeing, you know, development proposals, come into your town. And just because it's a national chain or a regional chain does not mean you can impose some requirements on how they are situated on the site and what they look like. And if you're interested in getting into that in great detail, we have a session, I think it's next week, on site plan review. We're going to talk a lot more about it next week, but I'm just going to touch on it tonight because this is another thing I worked with Danby, and I'm going to show an example of some design guidelines I developed for them in just a moment. Now, I know the much hated Dollar General, right? And in fact, there were rumors that Dollar General was going to build in the hamlet of Danby. A lot of people were dead set against this. They did not want this in the hamlet. At the time, I worked for the town, so I had to do what the town desired. And there were folks that saw the advantages, perhaps, of something like this. Me personally, I would have, you know, I don't want to comment on their business model, but I will say that having run back pre-COVID, having run some evening meetings at Town Hall, it would have been really nice to be able to have a place in Danby for me to go to buy snacks for the meeting rather than have to drive all the way into Ithaca. And I think we need to sort of look at places like this, whether it's a Dollar General or whether it's a convenience store with a gas station. This is the 21st century version of those general stores we saw back on the historic map of the hamlet of Danby. So I know a lot of people, they don't like this type of development, and I completely understand. But I think it's important to also acknowledge that having something like this come to town can provide an amenity for some folks. And again, this is not going to win any awards for architecture, but this particular example from the town of Orchard Park outside of Buffalo, this is an above average Dollar General. So it goes to show that you know, if you stand your ground with these chains, you, the town or village, can obtain a much better result than what they walk in the door with. And that's what I'm going to end with here. What I did for the town was I worked with their planning board and developed these commercial design guidelines that we developed and put before the town board, and they adopted it as part of the zoning code. And it was actually an appendix to the zoning code. So these were meant to work with their site plan review process. So in their zoning code, there's a section on site plan review, and that section lists all these things that the planning board should consider when conducting a site plan review. And we just added a number 14 to that list of items. And that number 14 was these commercial design guidelines. So it provided them, they seem very pleased with this. I'm pretty pleased with this document, and it provided them with some guidance on what to look for when a project like a Dollar General walks in the door, and the the citizen volunteers who make up the planning board are tasked with reviewing this. And I tried to develop this with plain language and some pictures and graphics to help them to help guide them through that process. I'm going to, let's see where we are. Yeah, so I'm gonna end there. This is my final slide. I'm gonna leave that up for just a minute, but then I'm gonna change screens and just quickly scroll through the commercial design guidelines themselves, just so you get a quick taste of that. But then we will be posting both the slides from this evening and the PDF of the commercial design guidelines on our local government workshop website. And if folks have questions, please feel free to reach out to me or my colleagues at GFL going forward. So again, I'm just going to switch screens here for just a moment. And quickly run through these commercial design guidelines. So the other thing that I think the planning board appreciated is, and I'm a big believer in this, is zoning codes have gotten way too voluminous over the years, and it's impossible to almost impossible for to administer them. So these guidelines are only 7 pages, and they include features that again, I'm a big believer in, graphics to illustrate where we want a building. So even a gas station, and again, remember I mentioned that the gas station convenience store, the convenience store portion of that is an amenity. It's a place you can get milk, you can get bread, usually you can get some very basics there, and that it doesn't have to be this huge thing with the gas canopy out front. The gas canopy could be on the side. The gas canopy can be a little more contextual with the neighborhood. Here's an example from Pittsford in Monroe County. But throughout these design guidelines, you know, there's that Tim Hortons again in Bushnell's Basin. We have FedEx office from Victor. The idea was, again, to clearly demonstrate to Dollar General or whatever chain walks in the door, that this is what the town expects in terms of how this development is going to be sited and fit into the context of the community. And again, we're gonna post these so you'll have access to all of this on our website very shortly. So with that, I'm going to stop talking at this point. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to use the chat room or raise your hand. Turn on your camera and wave, and I will unmute you, and we can have a bit of a discussion if folks have any questions or comments at this point. Yes, Michael, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay. Just to kind of I think I know the answer to this, but hamlets are
not hearing you. I know you're unmuted, but you seem very faint.
Well, let me see. Maybe I'll try this built-in mic. Can you hear me now? Still no?
Sorry about that. There you are. Okay.
Oh, I don't know. I didn't do anything, but.
No, I think it was on my end. Sorry about that.
Okay. I think I know the answer to this, but hamlets are not incorporated or anything like that, are they?
You are correct. They are not incorporated. They have no formal definition. And so, as I mentioned, that's the challenge. And, you know, how do we define what a hamlet is? And I'm really interested in, you know, sort of learning from the local knowledge. Like, you know, I've worked with your town a little bit in the past, and I know, you know, there's a hamlet most people refer to in the middle of the town there, and it's just sort of common knowledge. And and I think there used to be a store. I doubt it's open anymore.
Right.
And I think at this point it's probably just sort of a cluster of houses along the main road there. And you know, your situation is not uncommon.
Right. Actually, a couple of years ago, when we were defining the districts in the town, we defined the hamlet on a map. I mean, we define it as a certain distance from the main road and incorporating certain properties. And it's actually now in our town map as the hamlet of Italy.
And you when you say districts, you mean the zoning map, right?
Right.
Yeah. So that's one way to do it. And that's, you know, that's what a lot of towns do, is they will recognize the hamlets in the town with a different kind of zoning district. So I know my successor in Danby, that's what he's working on now with the town there, because they wanted to have zoning that treats the hamlets differently. You know, how to regulate development in the rural, forest, or agricultural areas of the town is different maybe than how you want to regulate development in the hamlet. And maybe you want the hamlet to be a little bit more like a tiny village. And you know, that's a challenge, especially if you don't have water or sewer, because you know, you need a certain amount of space for a well and distance from septic systems and that sort of thing. But I think that's a very smart way to do it, to acknowledge it in your zoning code. And there go the lights, but I'm still here. So anybody else have any questions? Looks like we had somebody in the chat room. Adeline, that is a great question. What is the best way to build sidewalks? This was I guess, are you looking for best way to fund it, or how to get residents on board with supporting the idea of sidewalks? And you can go ahead and ask verbally if you like.
Thanks. Yeah, it's more about getting residents on board. It's a very divided hamlet. There's most definitely people on both sides of the issue. In addition, there's varying setbacks, and some of the older, I mean, one of the buildings that's on the National Historic Register is right up on the road. So a lot of the sidewalks would have to be essentially right next to the right of way, or just the edge of the road. So, but it's really becoming kind of necessary to help foster the growth. I mean, it's a hamlet that has a store, a gas station, a restaurant, a liquor store, a hair salon, and a couple other small businesses and a church. So it's a pretty decent.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Like I think you mentioned in your message, this is a state highway.
It's State Route 21. Yep.
Yeah, so I would
talking about Cheshire, in case.
Yeah, okay, no, that's I've been down through there a couple times. I would try. So if it were me, my first step would be to try and get some detailed maps out of the state highway department, so you can see exactly where that right of way is. Because if you're lucky, you could actually fit the sidewalk on the public property, right? Like you don't want to be putting sidewalk on private property in somebody's front yard. And unfortunately, a lot of times what people perceive as their front yard is not always theirs. Like, you know, they've always sort of mowed the grass, but it actually belongs to the county or the state or whoever owns the road there. So, so that would be my first recommended step. And then I guess, you know, another thing, and of course, none of this is easy, and I completely sympathize where you are with this, but to, you know, maybe only sidewalks on one side of the road, and maybe call them a multi-use path rather than a sidewalk. And then it's something that, and there's legal distinctions there. You know, you legally, you can ride your bike on a multi-use path. You can't ride your bike on a sidewalk, that kind of thing. And I think people just perceive a path as less urban, and maybe there'll be a little bit less opposition to that. So, so that's my short answer. You also mentioned sewers.
we've looked into it before, and it was cost prohibitive, but we're considering putting all the ARPA funds into sewers there, so.
Yeah, yeah. So that's, you know, as I'm sure you realize, that's a double-edged sword. Like it
Yeah.
can do a lot in terms of, you know, allowing that sort of compact sort of village scale development much easier, but then it can also lead to a lot more development than you were hoping to see. So let us know if you think we can help in any way. Are you, that's the town of Canandaigua, is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so so you have some good folks down there at the town, so I'm sure they're helping you out. But if you think we can help as well, feel free to reach out to Genesee Finger Lakes.
Thanks.
We had another question. Oh, third place slide up again. I can do that. If there's no other questions, I thank you so much for coming tonight. Please feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions, and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone. And remember to sign up for the other sessions we have in the coming weeks at the local government workshop. Have a good night.